Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Party. We have finished our rainbow log cabin quilt and now it's time to bind it. So let's first learn how to prepare the quilt for binding so that way it's really easy to attach that binding strip and secure it entirely by machine. So I've set up the quilt here all around the machine and I have lined up my walking foot right with the edge of the quilt. So I'm stitching about 1/8 of an inch inside the edge. Now I have to say, usually on most quilts I add an extra wide border and that always makes it a little bit easier to trim the quilt down and make sure it's nice and square. Well, with this quilt we don't have an extra border, so I first stitch all the way around the quilt exactly 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Now I'm going to go through and I'm going to stitch basically between that line and the absolute edge of the quilt. This is called a victory lap. It's an extra line, 2 lines of stitching going around, and it helps to stabilize the edge of the quilt. It also makes binding a lot easier, particularly when you have puffy batting like this. It's real lofty. Sometimes it's hard to even trim the quilt down. By adding these 2 rows of stitching, it really does make it a lot easier. I also like to do a little back stitch where I have seams. I do just a little back stitch and then go back forward. And that helps to reinforce the seams too, so the seams don't start gapping as you're binding your quilt. So I think that this is a really important extra little step in the binding process, and it definitely helps to make binding faster and easier by machine. And it also helps, I think, to keep the quilt together. You know, this little bit of extra back stitching on the seams helps to lock those fabrics together so they're not going to come undone. And then of course we've got all of the lines of stitching in the corners where we stitch straight off into the batting area. This row of 2 rows of victory lap stitching are going to catch all of those threads and lock them in place too. Of course we're going to have even more stitching going around as we add the binding to the edges of the quilt. But I just think that this is a really important step. It's something that I learned from my friend Krista Watson. She posted a picture of it and I was like, you know what, that is the smartest thing I've seen, because it really stabilizes that edge. It gets it really nice and locked together. And then all of these lines of stitching here that are going into the batting, it's going to lock them in place too. So it's very, very easy to stitch so long as you set it up so that you are stitching clockwise in a clockwise direction, because you have very little quilt in the arm of the machine. So when I need to turn a corner, I just kind of pull it around, and most of the quilt stays to the left side of the machine or behind it. This is one of those things that I think is really helpful to have your machine pushed up against a table. Pushed up against a wall. Your table's pushed up against a wall. And the reason is, as you push and manipulate the quilt, it will very easily slip off the edge of the table. If you've got a wall behind it to push against it, well, that's going to make it that much better. It's not going to have anywhere to go. You're going to kind of lock it in place or put it in prison so it can't flop off the edge of the table. The wall will kind of keep it up on the surface and make it really easy to slide through. And you can see just how fast. I mean, this is super, super speedy stitching. I'm putting my foot down. I'm not really worrying too much about keeping my stitches itsy bitsy tiny. I'm letting the walking foot walk, but I'm putting my foot down and letting the machine go a little faster than I have so far. So it's not super time consuming. It's definitely an important step in the binding process. So I'm going to finish this up. One last row of victory lap stitching. I'm going to finish this up and then we'll start preparing our binding to finish up our quilt. So our quilting is done. Our victory lap stitching is stitched along the edge, and now I am trimming up my quilt and squaring it so that way it's ready to bind. So I'm lining up here. I've got a nice straight edge down here. I'm lining up with my ruler, just making sure that's nice and straight, and then give it a cut. And I really do like a 60mm rotary cutter. In order to cut, it has less revolutions because it's a bigger cutter. So I really think that it stays sharper longer. So that's why I like a big chunky rotary cutter. And it's really helpful when cutting through all these layers. You want a nice sharp rotary cutter because you're cutting through the batting, you're cutting through the backing. You want it to be a nice smooth cut, and you don't want to have to sit there and do it over and over again if your cutter is particularly dull. Okay, so I'm coming up here, lining up the ruler. And don't worry if you accidentally trim off some of your victory lap stitching. That's a-okay. That's why we went around it twice. You can actually go around it a third time if you want to and stitch right along the edge of the quilt. It's totally open to you as well. And that's the thing, the victory lap stitching will slightly shrink the edge of your quilt, and it will definitely stabilize that area very nicely. So I say the more lines of stitching you put in that area, the easier it will feel to bind your quilt. You know, more stitching gives you more control. So there we go. I've cut all the way off one side, and then now I'll rotate the quilt around to cut the opposite edge. And this is squaring. This is making sure that corner is nice and straight and square so that when we go to bind, that angle is a perfect 90-degree angle. So here we go. This is really, I think, the most crucial thing when squaring up a quilt is put a nice big 12-inch ruler on that edge, line it up with what you've just cut. So you've got the line you just cut lined up with a thin line on the ruler. Make sure it's straight all the way across. And then you can kind of nudge it over. So right here, just kind of taking a look at what I've got over here, I'm going to be trimming off just a little bit of that black fabric, or I can nudge the ruler over just slightly, and that will be leaving a little bit of batting instead. So you kind of have to figure out which is the better option for you. I oftentimes will leave just a little bit of batting and trust that my binding is going to completely cover and conceal that and stabilize that. So that's how I do it. And make sure that it's a nice 90-degree angle, and then now you have a straight line along this edge to line up with, and you can continue trimming up all the rest of the sides of your quilt. So just take your time lining this up, and don't worry if you trim off a little bit of the top fabric. You know, some things push outwards, you know, and sometimes the quilting will push the fabric outwards, sometimes it will shrink it inwards. So don't worry about that too much. Just focus on creating a nice straight line along this edge, and of course, nice 90-degree corners. So that way it's going to bind really, really easily. So that's it for this video. I know this extra step of doing the victory lap and trimming the quilt square is a little bit extra and might seem a little time consuming and silly, but I promise you this will make a big difference in binding your quilt. When you go to stitch on the binding, that edge of the quilt is going to be nice and secure and stable. It's going to be so much faster and easier to apply your binding, flip it over, and secure it entirely by machine. So make sure to check out our other tutorials. We'll have a two-parter, binding part 1, binding part 2. So make sure to watch all of these videos so you really get the hang of binding your quilts entirely by machine. It's much faster, really simple, and it gets your quilt finished fast. That's the point. Now, if you'd like to find the pattern for the Rainbow Log Cabin quilt so you can make it too, you can find it in the book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. This book comes with a wealth of information about walking foot style quilting, as well as 7 fun quilt projects so you can learn a lot and apply the designs from the book to real quilts. So come and check it out at leahday.com/walkingfoot. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt!